how would they implement this? What are their barriers of access? How do I help them overcome that barrier or drop their guard of protecting this community? And I think that's probably the best recommendation if you're outside of the educational space is find your educators and pick their brains.
Welcome to the podcast that helps speakers and writers like you grow their impact and income. This is Stage, Page, and Screen. Here is where I do want to genuinely start with you. I think you'll enjoy this question.
Okay.
You know, they say that baking is a labor of loaf.
No, we're going to go ahead and take that again. Can we take that again?
No, I'm not doing that again.
Okay.
I'm not insulting folks with the pun again. Here is my genuine question to you. Can you tell us what you've learned about writing or speaking from sort of your fascination in the art of baking bread?
There's quite a lot. Okay, so let's straight off the cuff.
A little backstory?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I got real long before it was cool during like COVID shutdown. I got real into just cooking in general, but specifically bread baking, having my own sourdough starter and just like all the different facets of different loaves. And like I can get real nerdy around like the science of bread and all the different phases and the hydration levels. To the point where like that kind of became associated with me as a human being. Like people would see bread and they're like, "Oh, I saw this great loaf of bread and I thought of you." And I'm like, I don't really know how to take that, but I'll take that in the most
That's
positive
good for
way.
you. My identity wrapped around alcohol during quarantine, so I feel like yours is certainly healthier.
Yeah, I'll take that one over for sure. So yeah, I'm super passionate about just all things cooking, but specifically bread baking. And I mean, the thing that I love, we're gonna get real nerdy here, is just this idea that you can take something completely raw, separate ingredients, and you can take, you really only need 4 ingredients for a loaf of bread. You need flour, water, salt, and yeast, and that's it. And you don't even need to like buy packaged yeast. Like the air has yeast all around it. That's what starts sourdough. And so for me, that level of like, you can take just these basic ideas and using your own skill set and your own investment, like you can create something amazing. And so there's like that, tug at the heartstrings sort of space of like, that's kind of what I feel like writing and speaking is in general is you take these ideas that might already be out there that you've experienced, and then you get to work some magic and translate that. But, a little bit more in the learning level of just like the quality of ingredient matters. Like if you have crap coming in, you have crap coming out in many ways. And so I think it is just that constant pursuit of like, how can I make this a little bit better? How can I get a little bit better with my ingredients? How can I just pay attention differently? So we can keep going, because the other space I'll go is like the environment that you're in can vastly impact the result that comes out. So the humidity of the room or the temperature of the room, your altitude of where you're at, like that's almost kind of that audience piece of like, you have to be able to react. You can't just follow the exact directions that were written for you. You have to pay attention to the whole process. You have to look for these cues and these signs of what to do in certain moments. And so yeah, that's my shoot from the hip response of like how bread baking kind of translates.
Close in prayer. That was powerful. That was good stuff.
Yeah, I thought it might translate because the ingredients are simple. The ingredients are known. Mm-hmm. But the result of someone's product varies so greatly. And you go, how is this simple loaf of bread so good and so much better than what I'm attempting to make at home or compared to some other product? Do you think it's a craftsmanship, it's the quality of the ingredient, it's number of reps, or it's all that?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of that, but I think the reps is the most important part of the only way to get better is to just try. And like, that's the other thing that can be a little bit challenging of just cooking in general, specifically baking, is you have to wait a long time and it might bomb. Like for some of the loaves that I do, we're talking like a 4-day process of how long it ferments and where it ferments. And so like you put all this into it and like it might turn out horribly wrong, but you just learn from it and you try to adapt for the next time around. And so I think that's the piece I think anyone can learn how to bake or learn to cook or make anything. But you just have to have that patience of like, I know that I'm going to make some mistakes and we're just going to roll with it. And hopefully it's at least edible or stomachable for myself or others. And you just go through that process over and over again. There was a moment where my wife and I had to be like, we need to stop eating so much bread product because it was, every day because I got so obsessive. It was like, I want to figure
regular.
This out. Right? This is abnormal for sure.
Yes, so. Yes, we're too young to be taking Metamucil as
well. Yeah.
So you have an interesting journey as someone who's has product services on stage, on page, on screen. I want to talk through each of those today. Let's start with stage.
Okay.
Can you tell me about the first PD or keynote that you sat in the audience as a educator, and that experience was either so bad or so good that it inspired you, and you thought, well, I could probably do that, or I would desire to do something at that level. Either so bad or so good, it sparked something in you.
Yeah, that's a great question. The very first time I sat in like an opening keynote was my very first hire year at my district. And, most people know, like, I look young and I started teaching 15 years ago. So I look like a child. Like, I looked like the teenagers I was working with. And I had this long, ridiculous hair. And I remember this speaker, like, he wanted to just play around with the crowd. And so when they first announced me in front of the whole district of like, here are our new hires, like people in my staff, my colleagues, like they literally, there was this silent moment and then there was giggling. And then there was like these hushed points towards me.
And
it was like
schooler in here.
Like it was this moment of like, oh, like I'm not getting the same reaction that every other new hire is getting. So the speaker actually picked up on this. And so, he does this. I don't even really remember the content of his speech, but he was doing some reenactment of the Rocky movie and the statue of like him holding up his arms. And so like he calls me out because he knows that I created a response from the audience, and he makes me, for whatever reason, I don't remember when, just literally stand up on stage while he gave his speech, just like flexing. And just like more or less,
hold on.
Everyone just got to laugh at me. I'm talking like 20 minutes at least. So like he gave most of his speech, and then the tail end, like
there's a moment. Child labor laws. I mean, you were 11 at the time.
There was something illegal about that moment. So it was absolutely like that was a moment of this is kind of weird. And I remember having this thought of like, he got an effect, but I guarantee he made more money in that 45-minute experience than I will make all year as a first-year teacher. So that was one of my first experiences of like, a lot of different people from a lot of different angles can do this thing called speaking. But there's also a difference, and maybe we'll get into it later, I think, of like speaking versus professional development. And even though I can't remember exact professional development that I sat in for a bulk of my career, I can remember consistently over and over again, it wasn't very effective. And there are many reasons why it felt like this is a complete waste of my time and my colleagues' time for someone who's just traveling in. It feels like they're just bought into this program and making a buck, and then they're moving along. And so that has always registered on my mind, whether it is public speaking and doing more keynote style or doing professional development workshops, full days, multiple days. It is how to make sure that whoever's in that audience doesn't feel the way I have felt over and over again of there are so many things I'd rather be doing with my time and energy. So those are a couple answers that come to mind from that question.
And when you say specifically it wasn't effective, can you kind of tease out what you meant by that at that time?
Yeah. A number of things that come into play with like effectiveness is, I think for any professional development to actually be deemed effective, that it should translate into observable moments in a classroom setting that wouldn't have happened without that professional development. So not having practical skills, in staying in that theoretical bubble of like, we're going to talk about the philosophy of these ideas, but we're not actually going to give you time, structure, examples, support, coaching to actually take that broad picture and put it into your actual context with your students. And so I think that's one of the first pieces is someone going to teach, interact, function differently as a result of our time together. And too infrequently were there those moments of like, oh, I actually took something and used this that had a positive impact on either me personally or the students I serve or my colleagues.
So let's maybe start to tease out some of the difference between a keynote and a PD. Yeah. Sitting here today now as a former educator and now as someone who's going around and doing this, how much of that sort of practicality and contextualizing it to the classroom that you're talking about, how much of that should be present in a keynote versus present in a PD? And I love percentages, so if you can give me a percentage, like, hey, maybe
I was waiting for it.
Oh yes, and I'll design a pie chart in real time, of course. But maybe for you, your aim is maybe something like 10% of that's present in a keynote versus X percentage present in a PD.
Well, I'll start by saying that's one of the biggest evolutions for me personally is I started deep in professional development work long before I started getting into keynote work. And Josh, you probably remember some of the growing pains of like when I was first doing keynotes, I was very much treating it more like a workshop, professional development, and just realizing that like those are different beasts, that a keynote is called a keynote for a very specific reason of it is supposed to set an emotive tone for the rest of the conference and the rest of the work that is done. And so when I would move into keynotes, I really put all this pressure on myself of like, we have to like stay in the practical land, in strategic land, and the talking nothing but research and what it looks like in the classroom, like stay in that spot, and realizing that that's not often why someone gets hired for a keynote. Like they get hired to set that tone that then can help them do the additional work with whatever workshops or professional development they do. So I had to learn along the way, and that was almost like a discomfort point of I had to be okay knowing that to some extent that keynote has to be more towards the emotional end and the storytelling end, and for lack of a better phrase, the performance end as a speaker than the facilitator lens of workshop or professional development facilitator. And so if you were to put it down into percentage, I think, kind of where I've landed with what has been successful and resonated well with my keynotes is that I would say they're probably about 60%, maybe drifting into 70%, really story driven, get the laughs, get the cries, bring in some of the logical appeal through research and build in some interaction. And then 30% to 40% is more in that, like, here's an actual strategy I'm going to give you. And here's what that might look like in your classroom. Or you do some theorizing. What would it look like for you to apply this within your world? Versus a workshop or professional development, I think is almost a flip. It has to be, there's absolutely some humor that needs to be engaged, and there has to be those emotional connections because people need to see you as an authentic human being, an authentic educator. But it really should be a lot of facilitating their work, their thinking, their connections around the content.
Yeah, I used to describe sort of a good educator keynote as make them laugh, make them cry, give them hope. But I think that final step you're talking about, which is really like, make them laugh, make them cry, give them hope, and arm them with tools, like something they can say, something they can do, a strategy that they can implement. And I think for a lot of speakers, particularly actually in my sort of situation where they have an adjacent story that would be quite inspiring to an educator, which is why folks like me often, get asked to do a keynote, is because the inspiring story is adjacent. It's like, here's a kid's trajectory that went through a hard time, stories of educators that provided these poignant and important moments of intervention.
Right.
And the message is essentially like, hey, you can be that educator too. But with folks like me, we can be guilty of just stopping at give them hope. Which indeed is an important tool, but then leaves out as I so beautifully forced you to do, give me a percentage, leaves out that 30 to 40% of arming them with some specific tools. Yeah. So if we flip the tables and you were coaching me back when you were an educator and I was going around talking to groups that you were sitting in, how can I understand how to extract a tool from my inspiring story if I have not spent time in the classroom?
That is a very important question, because what was lingering through my mind is I think educators are some of the strongest gatekeepers to the community of education. And I think for very specific reasons of so many educators do get micromanaged and talked down to, and decisions are made beyond their even control or influence, and they don't get paid enough and they don't have the respect. And so as a result, teachers are very guarded of like, who's going to try to tell me how to teach? Like, you don't know my students, you don't know my world. And so sometimes a trap that I think a speaker might fall into is making an assumption of like, ooh, this helped me in my personal life, so like they will like this. And then it almost comes off as patronizing, or at least I wouldn't say disrespectful, but lacking that empathy piece of like, I actually know what you're going through in order to apply it. So I think if someone's outside of education, one of the best things they can do is find their educator friends or people they know and run through their content or ideas with them first, and just openly ask them like, A, is this useful to an educator, a typical educator? B, what would it look like for you to take this idea and actually put it into practice? Like, how would I know, or how would you know that you are doing something different as a result of this keynote, this workshop, this speech? And just really trying to like get into those conversations. And one thing that has always been helpful for me is, I worked with dozens, hundreds of different educators throughout the time. So when I go into plotting out or planning what an action step would be, I literally think through the lens of all these various teachers. Like, ooh, that guy was the most cynical human being I've ever taught with in my life. Like, what would it take for him to apply this? Or this person, they try every idea and then they burn themselves out. And so how would I also frame this in a way where they don't feel the pressure of having to do it all exactly like this? And so it's almost like creating these little archetypes of various educators of like, how would they implement this? What are their barriers of access? How do I help them overcome that barrier or drop their guard of protecting this community? And I think that's probably the best recommendation if you're outside of the educational space, is find your educators and pick their brains.
Agreed. Yeah. And for me, I've found it very helpful to just name that elephant in the room with absolute clarity, absolute candidness, and no gray area BS, slightly lying to the audience. You see a lot of folks that go around and speak at schools, and so then they will slightly exaggerate that term and say, I work with schools, or I work in the ground with schools. It's like, look, if you get there an hour ahead of time for a sound check and you speak to 800 students, that ain't working with kids. That ain't working with students. That ain't going through what these folks are going through. And so I think just acknowledging exactly what your lane of expertise is and is not, and staying in your lane of expertise can at least perhaps tone down or mute down some of that patronizing effect you could unintentionally put out.
Yeah, for sure. Because there is that BS detector that many educators have. Like they listen for those terms, and they are looking for that credibility piece. And the more moment they can sniff out like, ooh, this person's really just trying to stretch their actual experience in education, then now all of a sudden we've really turned them against us rather than just at least being in a neutral space. I think the other thing I would add, and this is kind of my hot tip, is I don't think a speaker has to have the answer for here's what it looks like in the classroom. I think it is more effective and more respectful when you frame this around a question of what would this look like in your classroom? How would you know that you are applying this? Because I think that's the other space where a lot of educators feel micromanaged, is like people telling them what to do, even if they're coming from the great intentions of most educators like, I can figure out how to do this. I just need time. I might need a couple examples of what it might look like, but I need the time. I need the opportunity to process this idea and match it with my context, my style, and my needs. And so I think for a lot of educators, don't be afraid to flip the action step into a question of what would it look like for you and how would you apply this. Has helped me a lot with kind of letting down some of that guard and not feeling the pressure of I have to know what every single educator would do with this information.
I want to talk through your brilliant kind of methodology around gradient. Mm-hmm. There's a difference between a keynote and a training, and there's a different responsibility with the speaker versus the audience.
Yeah.
My mentality as a speaker, I need to show up on the stage preheated, and I need to be bold and courageous very quickly with the audience.
Yeah.
Whereas you have this really, I think, brilliant philosophy that the inverse should be true with the audience. We should safely and slowly lead them to warm up if they so choose, versus kind of expecting them to go there right away. Can you talk through this idea of gradient and how you use it?
Oh, yeah, I would love to. First, I want to give credit where credit is due. This concept first came my way with a professional development company that I worked for a good decade or so, called the Quantum Learning Network. And that was my training ground. They gave some of the best, if not the best, development training for facilitators that I've ever come across. And so they were so intentional. Like, one of their tenets as a company is everything speaks, so everything must be on purpose. And really getting hyper focused through the lens of not only like what we're doing with ourselves on stage, but what sort of experience we're providing for our audience and how we're strategically thinking big picture all along the way. And so gradient is this idea, we talk of it in terms of like low gradient to high gradient, in terms of the audience's emotional connection, openness, and trust. And so I'll give you an example of something that seems really little, but can actually be a bit of a high gradient shock for an audience that might turn them off or the wrong way. Is I have seen it, experienced it so many times. I've done it so many times where like someone kicks off and they're like, all right, good morning. How y'all doing today? And the audience like kind of claps. And then they do that move. They're like, that's not good enough. Let's all try that again. Everyone on your feet.
I get up and go to the bathroom right there. I'm out.
Especially for educators, they're like, just shut up right now. Like, I don't try to force me to have fake emotion. But what it is we are trying to get our audience to perform at a high energy level when they're not even ready for that yet. Like, they are still in that preheating phase. And so one of the elements that we can look at is what makes something low to high gradient is like how much energy our audience has to undertake to do something. Another element of gradient is to what extent they are talking like real deeply in an emotional space versus really surface level. And so a lot of times we could start off a little bit more surface level. Prime example of, a lot of times when I'll start off my keynotes, rather than having them do like a turn, pair, share right in that moment, it's just like I share various like multiple choice options of like, what was your biggest Zoom fail over the past few years? And it'll just be like, raise your hand if you ever had that moment where you forgot to turn off a setting and all of a sudden you're not muted anymore. And so it's real low gradient of like, they can raise their hand if they want to or not, but they at least have this slight little moment where we're starting to warm them up to the idea of we're going to be honest and vulnerable of our mistakes moving forward. And so I do that early on, and then they're going to do a little bit later on, a little pair share where they make a prediction over some research statistic. And so that's still relatively low gradient because they're only taking about 10, 15 seconds to interact with each other. So they're not having this deep, lengthy conversation. The content is safe. They're not talking about their personal world. They're not having to be vulnerable, but they're starting to get a little bit more warmed up to the idea of later on when we go real deep and we start talking about some more emotionally engaging topics. We've already had these little substeps to build up the gradient. So those are some of the elements of trying to start off with very brief little interactions, not a whole lot of emotional sharing with one another, but we're still very strategically building to a larger emotional connection or vulnerability.
It reminds me a lot of some research I read about sort of human vulnerability and relationships. And the author talked about sort of these 3 layers. Layer 1 is events. This is why you meet someone new, you're likely to talk about the weather or the sports or politics or whatever. Secondly is sort of wrestling with ideas, because when we wrestle with ideas, we share maybe a bit of our purview, a bit of who we are as a person, because that, of course, shapes the ideas that we're passionate about. And then that 3rd layer is feelings. And that's, that's the one that takes the most safety and trust to get to open up about and such. And it feels like that same mentality is what you're sort of doing here with your audience, not trying to flip that and expect them to go deep right away, even though, and do you still agree with this, is your mentality that you as a speaker are going to try to go deep right away? Or do you, or as a speaker, do you try to kind of ramp up with them, or you're going to try to go deep right away?
I typically, if I'm going to go into an emotional space, which I do pretty early on, I try to keep it more in like the humorous, self-deprecating mode. In part, and this is something that I've just noticed in working with teenagers throughout the last decade and a half, and now into working with adults, is audiences sometimes aren't ready for that deep, like throw into the deep end of something that could be potentially traumatic for them to process. And so I actually like provide a, quote unquote trigger warning ahead of time of like, hey, later on in this speech, in this conversation, like we're going to be having some deep topics. And one of the topics that's going to come up is blank. And that's something I learned from other speakers who've just kind of prefaced that. And so I think you can absolutely, as a speaker, like I can go to an emotional space and I can share my story, but I at least want to be aware of how do I prep my audience before I make them start to get into that space as well. So there is kind of a difference between how I'm thinking about my content development versus how are they experiencing that content throughout the speech or the workshop.
And how would you wrestle in your mind that, maybe sort of giving them a heads up of what is coming, you go, are you in any way, is that some sort of almost emotional spoiler where it's like, if I could just, like in a movie, if I could just startle them, surprise them, we're going around a corner and then this pops up, would that not be more emotional? You go, well, it would be, but for a certain slice of the audience, that's going to be too much for them. And then I'm actually going to lose a certain slice of the audience.
Yeah.
How do you kind of wrestle with that?
That was a real concern I had when that development of, within my previous company, we always called it like, you don't want to like pop the bubble or spoil the pop of revealing too much earlier on. Like you want some of that curiosity. And I try, I experiment with the various ways of like, I'm just going to kind of subtly tell them, hey, we're going to get into some heavy topics later, but not really tell them what those topics are. And then compare that to like, I'm going to let them know we're going to have some difficult topics. And I'm literally going to tell them like, this is one of the topics that's going to come up. Like suicide ideation is going to come up within this conversation. And I just kind of observed for, a good dozen plus speeches of like, what was the difference? And I didn't find any difference between keeping it a little vague versus being more specific. In fact, I had way more people afterwards say, like, send me messages and say like, thank you so much for like giving me that heads up, because I wasn't in an emotional space to process that. And just the layer of like, they felt respected as a human being to be able to be given a chance to engage differently. And so as much as we might be tempted of, I don't want to spoil too much, I think if your skill is good as a speaker in how you deliver that story, even if they had a heads up of what the topic is going to be, it is still going to land in a way that moves them emotionally, but safely, so that they don't feel so shocked or so in a defensive or trauma-based response that they don't actually hear the rest of the message along the way. So from my experience, I've really shifted from like, don't tell them anything to like, no, it's actually going to be more effective if I give them a pretty specific heads up and then just trust my skills in delivering that content later.
Agreed.
Very audience-centered, very audience-oriented versus... just how am I coming off? How am I looking? Versus I'm going to intentionally take their hand. I'm going to walk them into these spaces, and they might be a little nervous, but that's okay because they're with me and I'm with them, and that kind of thing. I like that a lot.
Agreed. Let's debate one final thing on this point.
Yeah.
What if would it be as effective if, as a part of the scripted introduction that someone from the host organization reads before you come up for the keynote, what if somewhere within that scripted, 5, 6, 7 sentence introduction, the warning was there? Hey, at some point in Chase's speech, he's going to get into some heavy topics, or at some point, he's going to get into these specific topics. Do you think that would be better because then it's coming from someone they already know? Or is there something about the act of you thoughtfully disclosing that actually earns you credibility and a bit of trust with the audience? Which would you place a bet on if you had to guess which you think would be more effective?
If I had to place a bet right now, I would bet on the speaker delivering that message themselves. In part because a lot of people space out during that intro. Like they're not even attentive within that moment a lot of times.
Quite fair, yes. And they're probably going to mispronounce your last name anyway.
They're going to butcher it and destroy it. I think potentially a happy balance or happy medium, and I've done this with a lot of organizations, is I always call ahead of time and speak with the organizer, whoever's bringing me in, and just kind of learn more about their audience. And I'll share with them, I'll say, I am going to be diving into some topics, and here's one of the topics that's going to come up. What should I know about your audience around this topic? And I've had multiple times where they've said, like, we actually had a suicide within our school district last year. And so that's information that then I share with them of, like, if on your end you feel like it would be beneficial to give your audience a heads up through the email or as you're, publicizing this, like, feel free to. Just so you know, I will also deliver that from the front of the room. And so then it's kind of you get both of those, of a little bit more prep work ahead of time coming from the organizer, but still me as an individual, like, I don't think I can rest without me being able to share. And maybe it's a control thing of, like, I want them to know that I care about their needs and where they're at, and being respectful of that. I don't want it to seem like I don't care.
And my OCD brain very much likes those redundancies that you've built in, where it's like they might say, oh yeah, we're going to send out an email, and that doesn't trickle down to the person that gets into the constant contact account, and therefore it's not put in there. You assume it, these are the sort of things that keep me up at night, Chase. Let's move to the page. Your books, The Burnout Cure and Illuminate the Way, they're both books on burnout. How do you think about, as an author, sort of owning a niche versus getting typecast in a topic and thus risking burning out on burnout yourself?
Yeah, for sure. What's interesting from my end is I never went into writing thinking I was going to be someone who writes about burnout. So my background in what really drove my teaching for a decade and a half was teaching positive psychology. And so I was a nerd diving into the science of well-being that, went beyond just like burnout and went beyond just a teacher's experience. And it was just really all those elements of gratitude, forgiveness, optimism, resilience, how it gets built. And so when I first pitched the idea to the publisher, I went through ASCD. It had nothing to do with, like, wasn't even called burnout, anything to do with burnout. It was just like, basically, here's my positive psychology class that has helped me as a human being deal with the challenges of education and not feel like I'm completely languishing or struggling. And so my publisher was actually the one of, like, hey, we want to reframe this as the burnout cure. And I had a hard time with it. I was like, but it's not a cure. I don't want to call it a cure. Like, what if people start sending me angry emails? But they were, very prescient in the idea of burnout is a real issue with our audience and with teachers. And so you're going to have a different level of understanding and interest if we're using that term burnout. And so what happened was, I shared around this topic, and I was really just teaching positive psychology. And what I experienced down the road was that this trend happened within my topic of, and it's still kind of lingering, where a lot of the responsibility or blame gets placed on the individual's shoulder around burnout and well-being. And so everyone was all about self-care. You just got to bring in the yoga instructors and do the mindfulness meditations with the teachers, and then they'll be okay. And then it's like, no, that's not helping. Like, that's not working with a lot of educators, because burnout isn't just an individual's fault. Like, it's organizational. And so that pushed me into this journey of, because I'm now being associated with burnout, which wasn't necessarily my initial intention, I really need to do the deep work and figure out how much of this is organizational versus individual and how to balance the two. So it was almost like the needs of the audience was driving me into a direction. And I don't regret for 1 second doing a deep dive, because I understand it on a different level than I ever would have before. But all that being said, I love positive psychology, and I love all of these other topics beyond just burnout, of how to help people be at their best so they can give their best and experience deeper meaning within the world. And so that's kind of the next phase of where I'm at, is trying to figure out, like, how do I make sure that I'm not the lone burnout guy, and that if I do have all of these other things that I have researched and developed for years, that I don't lose that credibility if people are like, well, what's this guy talking about, when like he's the burnout guy. So that's on my radar right now, is figuring out how to really make sure that the workshops I provide in professional development shows a range of my interests and passions and abilities. And so that it's not just they see these 2 major book titles and now that's pigeonholing me into this lane.
Yeah, I know you and I have had those conversations confidentially. It's like, how do you show that that was the beginning of what you had to talk about, but not the totality of what you had to talk about. And that's going to be tough when it moves from theoretical to practical, because that's going to mean a period of time saying, no, thank you, I'm not going to write a third burnout book. Right. No, thank you, for a period of time. This is the primary keynote I'm offering, which is not burnout related. And if you want the burnout keynote, you're going to have to get on the waiting list, or some sort of probably kind of tricky and intentional boundary with that as well to make that shift.
Yeah, I think that word boundaries is really important, because I think boundaries not only protect our own emotional space, but I think they're also clear communication to the people around us, to let them know what we need and what we're about. And so there are those elements of, I think sometimes, I should speak for myself, I feel the temptation sometimes of, I see these TikTok influencers, or I see these, big Instagrammers, all these names. And it's like, you can tell they have chosen this lane and they are committing full tilt to this lane. Like, all their content is just regurgitation of the same few ideas over and over, and they're getting great success with it. But that is not what is going to fulfill me as a human being. Yeah. I need to not only explore multifaceted interests and passions for my world, but be a human being that can share those, because not everyone in my audience is going to be burning out, and not every teacher is going to be languishing with this one topic. So how can I, in the long run, be able to sustain my passion while also providing the many different needs and issues that people are going to have in education and beyond?
Be brutally honest, how much longer do you think you could just do the burnout keynote, roughly 50 times a year, before you're burnout, bitter, and pissed off about giving it?
So if we go all the way back to our first question.
How long before you become Smashing Pumpkins? I went and saw the Smashing Pumpkins, and it was they might as well have called the tour, we burned through our money, we didn't save well, we didn't invest well, and we got to sing these damn songs to you people.
And that side note, that's one of my favorite bands ever, and I've heard they are terrible live. Just going through it. I think back to when you're talking about like bread and like baking, and there will always be an element of me wanting to have that pursuit of perfection. So I think I realistically could give that keynote for quite a long time, because I'm constantly going to be tweaking it. And I'm going to be looking for these little improvements and adjustments. So I don't know if I'll ever get to the point where I dread going up on a stage or in front of a group to do it. But what
if I said you're not allowed to change a single word of the keynote from the one you gave a couple of days ago? Like, it has to be locked.
Yeah, I think I could maybe do another year of it in that capacity.
So it's the subtle tinkering that breathes some life into it for you.
Yeah, I think the tinkering. I think there's also like as a speaker, as you do this and you interact with people, and hopefully you're continuing to stay up to date on your research and that's informing your ideas, is that there's always these like nuances to what you're talking about, and it shifts and it changes. And so how I used to talk about the concept of being a goodness curator 2 years ago is very different than how I approach it now, because I think just people's general knowledge, what I have as insight. So all that stuff is always going to evolve. I don't ever view a keynote as this static thing. It is very dynamic and it's going to be evolving and changing. But at the same time, I feel myself even now of those moments when I'm on stage and I've just delivered some line or even some like huge chunk. And I have that moment of like, I hope I just said that, because I kind of spaced out as I was talking. Like, it is so rehearsed and trained that I was able to say the words. And really what I'm doing is I'm paying attention to like that guy in the audience and seeing if he's reacting or not. And what am I going to do and how am I going to engage him, to the point where it's almost gotten, I don't want to say robotic, but it is so autopilot in some phases that that scares me. I don't want to be in that space where I'm just regurgitating something mindlessly. I want it to continue to live and breathe.
We'll be right back.
All right, so let me pitch you something. Are you someone that wants to launch and grow a speaking business? Maybe it's time to write and publish that book. Perhaps you want to create and sell your online course. Well, I've put together a free on-demand training video for you. It's not going to promise you the moon. It's not going to say it's going to happen quickly or without tears or sacrifice. But I'll pragmatically lay out for you exactly how to chart a course to do all these things we just talked about. You can find this free on-demand training video at stagepagescreen.com. That's stagepagescreen.com. I did a keynote last week in Illinois, and about one caring adult. Yeah. And I found this moment, just this single moment in it. I have this moment where I make fun of the first time I ever saw my foster dad. That he's 6'3", 350, and I make fun that he's shaped like a lowercase b. And then on stage in that moment, not planned, I make this connection that at 14, sitting in that foster care DHS van, at 14, I was overweight. And I made this connection that when a kid has been through trauma, that trauma does not allow them to recognize hypocrisy. Just the words fell out of my mouth. Trauma doesn't recognize hypocrisy. Sitting in that van, making fun of his weight, I too was overweight. And just that one moment, just that one kind of connection that I was able to make finally after a couple hundred times delivering it, gave me like a real giddiness to share that again in the future. So I think that tinkering, finding those small little adjustments can really, really sort of buoy up the speaker's own enthusiasm in delivering it.
For sure.
I hear like you're trying to remain authentic to who you are. So you're continuing to grow and you're learning and you're developing, maybe even in real time on the stage in front of people. And that's what you're bringing with the tinkering.
Yeah, I think so. But some things get so locked. It's like once you find a good joke, you actually don't want to mess with it, because now you've learned this pause, these 6 words, not the 8 words I used to do to deliver it. That's going to get the best reaction. And so there are certain elements where you almost feel like I can't mess with that. I can't mess with that.
Yeah. I think on the whole, there's almost having that mindset. And again, I think this is something that just comes from the background of being a classroom teacher, of never wanting as a speaker to assume or give any sort of indication that I know all the answers, that I have this figured out, that I am the source or credibility, and really moving, that cliche of, rather than being the sage on the stage, being the guide on the side, of just having that mindset of like, yeah, I am a nerd and I do some really deep research around this that I know a lot of teachers just don't have time for. Yes, I have, put some credibility and mastery into understanding these ideas, but still, like, we are exploring these together. So I'm gonna share my world, and I am gonna have some rehearsed stuff to like evoke some emotion. But there are absolutely these phases built in where I'm putting it on you all to make your own connections and do some conversation around it, and not assuming that I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this.
I want to go back to the Burnout Cure, ASCD recommending that title. Mm-hmm. And you sharing that story, you're like, oh, it's not a cure. That's sort of an overpromise. Yeah. I remember when we first started working together, when you first signed with TYS. I think this was some of my early advice to you, was I saw in you some of this, I think what I called sort of star colleague syndrome.
Yeah. Yep.
There was a real hesitancy to speak definitively because you were so used to speaking collegially. Mm-hmm. You were working day in, day out, elbow to elbow with your fellow educators. Mm-hmm. So everything had to be so nuanced, so contextualized. So, hey, this is a great idea, but not for this situation, not for this situation. It was like you would say a brilliant thing and then have 37 I mean, it sounded like a freaking like a pharmaceutical ad. Leakage. What? I'm sorry. I beg your pardon. Because I want to talk to you about advice, and maybe we get into it here. When I brought that feedback and guidance to you, were you hesitant to it at first? How did it hit you? How did you make sense of it? And then what did you actually do to go, okay, I don't want to lose the collegiality, but yes, I am being brought in as an expert, whether or not I'm comfortable with that title. So I do need to speak with that weight as well.
Yeah, I remember that feedback, and in the moment when you gave me that feedback, it was kind of that moment where you have the hard look in the mirror of like, okay, let's not pretend that we don't know where this is coming from or why you're doing this. A little bit of backstory. I first started doing professional development for my district when I was in my third year of teaching, which is ridiculously young to be leading professional development for your colleagues. And as a result of that, and just kind of how human dynamics are, I got labeled within my district as golden boy in not a very kind sense. Like, my name was used pejoratively of just this person who gets whatever they want without actually having to like have skin in the game. And so I very much overcorrected I was so hyper paranoid of, if I suggest something, like, do I even know what I'm talking about? Like, I'm going to get criticized. And so that's where I started to build in all these little disclaimers and all this, like, I want to try to make sure we're all on the same team so I don't get that label again. And so when you share that feedback with me, it was like, crap, he's right. Like, I have let this past experience saddle with me throughout the entirety of my development as a human being. And so from there, it became like, yeah, he's 100% right. But like, what does that shift and transition look like, especially when I have habituated those disclaimers and how I started off a keynote or workshop for years? It took some active work. And what helped me make the shift is primarily just talking with other speakers, because I didn't know many people who did keynote speeches. I knew a whole lot of people who did full day professional development, which is very building gradient and trying to slow warm up the audience. I didn't know a whole lot of people who were doing like, you got 1 hour and you have to make use of every moment intentionally to deliver an emotion and a response. And so speaking with a lot of other speakers and just like how they started off their talks, and even some of the advice from you of like, you're trying to get people in the deep end a little early to get them at least moving towards the emotion that you seek. So that was kind of the process of like, what do other people do? Like, how do they do this differently? Because I haven't really seen or experienced it. And then the last hurdle for me, I think, was overcoming the fear of speaking as a performance, because that was some baggage that I held on to of like, I don't want to be a performer. I don't want to be a person who just stands up on stage and goes through these robotic motions over and over again. Like, I still want to be authentic and relating with the crowd. And so it took quite a lot of work to get to the point of knowing that I can perform a speech and I can have these really rehearsed moments within my content, but I can do that in a way that doesn't lose my humanity and do it in a way that doesn't let others have this perception that this guy is just like a robot going through this, like he doesn't know what it's like. So a combination of just learning from other people and then just tinkering and practicing and figuring out what works, not only for getting the audience to respond more positively, but for me to feel comfortable in my skin doing it.
Now, feedback is still something that's important to you, that you actively seek, both from your audience, from trusted mentors, specifically from an audience. How do you make sense of what is helpful feedback and sort of actionable feedback? And, hey, you know what? That's a fair critique. And I've heard that enough. Said differently, but I've heard that enough. It's that is definitely like, I need to make a product update here. That is totally fair pushback versus someone else's own baggage or situational awareness. How do you both have the posture where you're like, I want feedback, I don't want to close myself off to it, but parsing through what is useful and wise that you need to own versus what it is you just go, that's on that person, that ain't about me.
For sure. Teaching teenagers for a while is a good way to develop a thick skin and I think develop that the habit of being non-defensive. And so anytime I elicit feedback, which is very often, especially if I'm doing a workshop, I'm giving them index cards before a break and ask them to jot down what's one thing that you want when we come back in the afternoon. So I'm always looking for that feedback, but I really try to look at trends. So if this is creeping up a couple times, even if it's in different language, different audiences, I need to pay attention to that. Which I think most people do. They can look for that and they can recognize that. But I also am a believer in at least processing those sometimes isolated or outlier feedback pieces that we get. And I think sometimes we have to first just receive it and then give ourselves at least 24 hours, 48 hours to, set it aside before we come back to it. Because sometimes when something stings and it is isolated or it does seem like an outlier, it is so easy to just brush that aside and be like, screw that person. They're a crotchety crank. They don't know my life. They don't know what I've been through, but there could be really valuable information around that. And so I think giving ourselves a chance to just process it a little bit more. And if we were to look at the core idea behind that feedback of maybe the specifics they were talking about or the words that they were talking about could have been more tactful or didn't really relate to what I thought I was doing in that moment, but there's something there that they might be talking about. And I might want to go with the assumption that this one person might actually be representing more people than I thought who just weren't open enough or vulnerable enough or brave enough to share that information. Some of the most important tweaks and changes I've made within any of my workshops or keynotes came from those isolated moments. I remember the moment when I got the feedback that I should have provided a trigger warning to my content and that it was completely disrespectful not to give people a heads up that I was going to be talking about that idea. And I totally went to that land of the story was serving a higher purpose, but I sat on it for a little bit. And that's where I started to make those tweaks and changes of I do need to be a little bit more considerate and respectful. So I think the trends most of us do, but don't be afraid to look at those outliers. Just give yourself some time, try not to be defensive around it, and look for what's the larger conceptual idea behind that feedback.
Now, I want to put you on the spot of some feedback I've repeatedly given you that you have repeatedly, Jesse, he has ignored.
Here come the floods.
This is the whole point of this podcast. We're not even going to publish this one.
Yeah.
This is a staged intervention. We're 58 minutes in. Is this appropriate gradient time? Are you ready for this now, Chase?
I think
Are you ready?
So. Yeah, we're warm
up. Buckle up.
All right. So for Chase, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. For Chase, all right, so we were in Mexico, TYS, our agency, a bunch of the speakers, and Chase picks up a guitar, starts singing some random cover song, and I'm like, I hear it across the room, whoa, this dude can legitimately sing. And then I remember seeing, a couple sort of comedians that would close their show by kind of calling back some of the biggest laughs in a 3-minute comedic song. So it was like a really beautiful bow on their stand-up set. And I thought, man, this would be, and this was during that time where it's like, hey, in your keynote, you got to get out of like the workshop guy and you got to be a bit more performative. So I was like, dude, you should recap some of the key moments, ideas, strategies, lessons, funny moments, the fanny pack story, etc., in a song. And you said, that is a brilliant idea, and I'm going to absolutely not do it. So
love that.
So yes. So talk to me about what is your hesitancy to do that? And again, just in general, we all have these experiences. People bring us ideas. You're like, that's interesting, but that's either not for me or not for right now.
Yeah. I have many reasons that I'll call excuses for not adopting that feedback.
Let's get them on the record here.
So what has, I've obviously, well, maybe not obviously, internally, obviously, the biggest hesitation is feeling like I'm not adequate enough to do that. Like singing in front of people, I think, is a different skill than speaking in front of people. Singing humorous songs, writing humorous songs, I think is a different skill than like covering a song. So like there is that element of like, I would have to definitely do some deeper work and practice around like what that would actually look like to a point that I felt comfortable enough to do that on stage for a whole lot of other people. And then, the kind of sub excuses going along the way for me have been, I felt like I just recently got that main keynote like polished to a point where like it is landing really well. And like I have every minute kind of mapped out and I'm still sometimes going over the time limit. And so it became the logistical piece of like, how do I fit that in? Like what needs to be cut and adjusted? And, we have a hard time letting go of our babies of like, I have all these things I've worked forever to do. Like where would that come into play? So I am just getting to the phase of my own speaking skill or comfort of being okay, starting to make some of those big shifts and big dabbles around. I know I'm right now working on a new keynote. And so that is automatically going to require some growing pains and some shifts and some changes. And so this could be a phase of like, ooh, I could start to pull some of that from my previous keynote into the new keynote. And there's the space where I could do a song around the fanny pack story of Senora. So it's still there. I'll tell you, like, it's not like I just completely kicked it into the can.
I heard him say the new keynote is going to have a song in it. That's what I heard. I mean, it could be the Riverside.fm connection. I don't know.
It's there. I bigger picture, I think there's always discomfort or fear when we have to move into something that's working well into growth. And I think that's a big piece for me is like, I feel like I'm resonating and this one's landing well. So like, I don't want to mess with it yet, but I also know I'm going to have to tinker and continually adjust and change. So
yeah, my sort of analysis of it is, I think you have reluctantly embraced the necessary performer elements that a good keynote must have. You've reluctantly, but also wholeheartedly embraced those. And I think the guitar is almost like, now I could become like a caricature of a thing I don't want to be, where it's like, now I'm pulling out a guitar and I'm doing a song.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if too, there's, you're sharing serious ideas, thoughtful ideas, helpful ideas, where you go, could that cut across the tone that I'm trying to have as a speaker?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's again, a difference I see with potentially doing a song or music is, I experiment with jokes, and those jokes, 10 seconds we're talking about, like a story is a few seconds. But if I move into a phase and start singing a song and it isn't good, like they're sitting there with me for 2 to 3 minutes, cringing in a moment that could unravel or undo everything else that I've done. So it's kind of the hard challenge of typically that song would probably land best at the end. And because it would be new and because of risk, like ending out with that piece might make it challenging. But you're spot on that I think there is it's almost a symbolic thing of like when you pick up a guitar, you are literally performing. And I have struggled to make that transition of like, that is actually okay within this phase or experience of speaking.
Well, I think when I hear performing, I think if it's somebody translating. So you're translating those thoughts, those ideas into something that's going to be best for the audience or most helpful to the audience. And so freeing yourself from this is about me, and that's easy to say, of course, and that kind of thing. Because all I would want to do is like 60 minutes of funny songs. But I do think there is something where you can be free performing. I'm a performer, but if you're a translator using this performance to get those things across, there could be some freedom in there, some power in there to, use whatever device is best for that moment.
I'll keep harassing you. I'll keep harassing you, Chase. I think
it's still there. It's growing. It is growing in my mind every time we chat.
The new keynote. I think it could be a clever recapping vehicle.
Yeah.
That's how the conceptual vessel. I see the song as a conceptual vessel to recap all the highs and lows from the speech. In like here's the cliff notes through a humorous vehicle that there's, again, when the song is pitched humorously, you're surprised if the guy can sing well. So I think that part is kind of disarmed. Tell me about leading a PD in a remote village in Alaska. Tell me the gloriousness of how you just absolutely 10 out of 10 just 10 out of 10 nailed that.
It is one of the wildest experiences I've ever had as an educator, human being. That it was very difficult, but now lingers with me, and I'm so glad that I did it. So this was back when I was working for the Quantum Learning Network, and they were doing all sorts of professional development. And so a few times throughout the year, I get a chance to travel to these different schools, and all of a sudden this lead popped up of they're like, "Hey, we've got this remote village in Alaska, like." And when we say remote, like you can only get there by plane or snowmobile or maybe dog sled. And so if you do this, like you're going to have to be out there for a full week. And it was a joint experience of like working with their teachers and their professional development practices, but also working with their students as well throughout the day. And so of course I'm like, let's go. Like, of course I want to go into the middle of nowhere, Alaska. And I mean, just getting there was like a 2-day process, and you fly in this tiny little plane. Chivak, Alaska is the name of the community. I believe like the entire community is like 800 people. They've got their one school. They have no restaurants. Like I had to eat Hot Pockets, microwave meals the entire time I was there. No hotels. I literally slept in a inflatable mattress in a special education room, which let me tell you how freaky it is to sleep inside a school in the middle of the night. Like every single sound, I'm like, this is where murder stories happen. Like this,
especially those Hot Pockets backfiring on you. I mean, you're going to be making your own sounds.
Right. And like if I wanted to shower, I had to like wait until late at night and use like the locker room showers at the school in order to bathe. So like the context of it was like, you're going to have to be able to bring your best into situations that you're not used to and contexts that you're not used to. But kind of what made it additionally challenging was that the staff had not requested this professional development. And even though I stand by wholeheartedly the value of the professional development, they weren't requesting it. The organizer, who's no longer with the school for now obvious reasons, made them stay after the contractual hours, like late into the evening, for me to facilitate this professional development. And so like, I was the target point that all of their anger of that was guided towards. And like, that's where I got some real biting feedback of people just like attacking me as a human being. And so it was one of those thoughts of like, well, I can't just like call up the company and be like, I'm out. Like I have to wait for a plane to come get me. Like
they're never going to find your body. They're never going to find your body.
That's right.
We're stuck here.
It smells of cheap meat and cheese.
But in the process, like I had to really hone my skills of like, how do I try to let down their guards as much as possible, of get on an equal playing field of like, hey, we're working through this together, and I'm just literally here to help you. And I'm going to try to learn as much about your context and world as I can. The students were very challenging students. Like I remember I was in the middle of talking and I just watched this girl. She just looks over and hocks a loogie and just shoots it right onto the floor, like the carpeted rug, and then just like stares back at me. A kid comes up to me on a break and he's like, "You want to fight?" I'm like, what is what is happening right now?
What was your response? What did you say?
I was like, I'm not really much of a fighter. Like, it's not really my thing. So yeah, I mean, it was really, really challenging, but kind of the silver lining is they asked me back the next year. So I was like, yeah, it was
not where I saw this going.
Right. It was like to the point where I was like, I had to really think of, okay, they want me to come back, but that was really, really challenging.
Did you bring
but
more
coming
Hot
back
Pockets this time?
I did. I was well prepared for more snacks. But coming back the second time, it was like a lot of the students remembered me. They were excited to see me. The most critical teacher from the previous year I was there, she asked me to come into her classroom to watch how she was implementing some of the things we talked about. So it was like, I'm glad I stuck with it to get some of those success stories, but holy cow, I would not wish that professional development or speaking experience on any facilitator, because
now 2 days to get there. How many days of actual training were you doing?
I did the first year I did 3, and then the second year I did 4.
So a couple hours into day 1, this is not going well. And yet I am contractually obligated for another 68 hours of this.
Yes. Yep. And when you're literally just there to present and your space to escape to is just a classroom, like there's no entertainment to distract my brain from it. So I'm just sitting there stewing on this is really challenging. They hate me. What am I going to do? I have to do all this content again tomorrow and try to connect with them. So
what do you think won them over? Was it more who you are, just sort of being honest about that? Was it the content? Was it just a combination of both?
It was probably a balance of both. I mean, the content is really, really good content. I mean, it's all brain-based learning. It's the type of stuff where no one can really go into it and not get something from it. One of the critical pieces is when I share my background, I'm an English teacher. One of the critical teachers oh, great, another one of those English teacher types. And so it was ooh, just that alone creates some division. But the way the content is structured and set up is it doesn't matter what you teach, you can use these strategies. So having solid content was one. And then I work really hard to just be professional and also be relatable. I remember I asked for their feedback cards, and that's where I got these really biting bits of feedback. One person said, "Wear better clothes," just mean stuff. It was Mean Girl stuff.
I don't know. Do you have photos from back then? I mean, let's keep an open mind here.
I was married then, and so my wife was very much training me how to dress well. I went back into it the next day, and I was like, "Hey, I got a chance to read through your feedback, and I want to share some of the insights that I got." And so I shared some of the things of some of this was really helpful for me. Thank you. This is what we're going to do differently moving forward. But I did kind of call them out a little bit of I did get a couple bits of feedback that weren't necessarily helpful. So for example, someone told me to wear better clothes. I'm so sorry. I only packed 1 suitcase. I don't know if you guys have any suggestions or any stores I can buy clothes, let me know. To kind of call them out and deflect with humor a little bit. But it was definitely you earn your skill set by being placed in some of those situations. And yeah, it was wild.
I spoke at a gymnasium in Michigan, actually, where you hail from. It 1,200 students in a gym, all sides of the gym, so surrounding me. Horrific sound system, hour-long assembly. And within 90 seconds in, I knew I have no one's attention. No one's. And I literally cried after that assembly. I think I was 22. Yeah. I cried and I was like, never again. I'm done. This is it. This is terrible. Yeah, those moments are painful, but undoubtedly shape us.
Yeah, it almost kind of serves as I don't want to say rock bottom, but it was the hardest thing I've ever done from a professional development standpoint. So now when the technology isn't working perfectly, right, or half the staff is sitting way in the back and they've brought their own papers to grade, I don't take it as personally because I've been through that challenging moment of okay, if I can get through a week in remote Alaskan village with that, I can deal with this for the next hour or 6 hours of a training.
Let's turn our attention to screen. Talk to me about the course you created, Reignite, which is squarely aimed at educators. You put together, there's videos, there's downloads, there's different elements. Talk to me about how you kind of first thought about the elements you would take from your keynotes, from your training, and begin to put together that course?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky way or translation to make. I think possibly, it's a nice combination of if you have some good writing skills and you have some good speaking skills, like you somewhat can marry those two together. But virtual delivery in general is a different beast, I think, than speaking in person, but especially when it's pre-recorded and you're trying to build and structure things in. Teaching through the pandemic was super helpful. I think I actually was creating the course in 2020, 2021. And so it was automatically I'm having to learn these skills of best practices with recording content and how to make it not too much information and how to provide the writing support and the different activities and discussion. And so it's kind of the trial by fire of a lot of that helped translate. But still, I think it's really hard not to want to turn a virtual course into multi-day experience for people, because you get in front of the camera and you're like, oh, I have all this stuff I want to say and all this stuff I want to deliver, and there are all these activities, but still having to put yourself in the mind of the audience is really, really important. That even if I can talk in front of a camera for an hour and I have all these activities, sure enough, no one's going to sit and listen to that for a while. So a lot of it was just trying to take core ideas and just chunk them as much as possible. So everything I started looking through these little phases of normally if I do 20 minutes of content on this in a professional development workshop or speech, I'm going to chunk that into 4 different pieces. And so how do I divide up those pieces? Still, it's that is the area of my work that I want to do the most tinkering around still. I'm in a process of revising that based off of feedback and just, all the things of now you have to get a better camera or a better microphone because you want to increase the quality, because if the quality isn't good, then they're going to think the ideas aren't good as well. And that's, I think, very different beast to take on sometimes than I'm just writing and by myself on my computer, or I'm speaking in front of a group of people.
Agreed. I want to get into the nitty gritty of this. With each of these videos within the course, would you write it out manuscript word for word? Would you write out the first sentence, the last sentence, the rest was bullet pointed? I mean, when you stood up and hit record, what were you looking at that the audience isn't seeing?
I do not do as well scripting it out, because if I miss the script or if I think of something kind of on the fly, I just start to fall apart in my head. And so I would end up spending more time trying to record it perfectly because I had already written it out how I wanted to be in my mind. And so I've always kind of benefited, especially I think my style of speaking is much more kind of conversational. I'm not too worried about having little fillers start to creep in here and there, or have the little jokes that just kind of come impromptu. And so the way I would structure it out is I would start with my slides of, I know I have this content on the slide, and to make sure I don't miss that content, I'm literally going to make sure it pops up as a bullet point so that I can have some recall and not get lost in the moment. So slides are always my starting point of just getting that piece mapped out first with some of the specifics. And then typically what I would do is I would do a little dry run. So I would not even hit record on the camera. I would just run through those slides, get it into my system, hear how it sounds, time it to see, because a lot of times I would talk for way longer than I thought I would. So that was kind of my structure piece. And I think...
Did you show anyone those dry runs?
No, I don't think so. I think I was kind of working in isolation around that. Most of the feedback I got was after I put together a draft and had a small group of people that I trusted. I shared it with them and gave them access and asked them for feedback. And so they gave sometimes very targeted feedback on specific videos and sometimes more general, more broad.
But so you didn't have any kind of bullet pointed written outline in front of you. It was more so like your slides acted as those key talking points or bullet points. Is that correct? Yeah.
I think part of my comfort in doing that, again, not to go on this ad nauseum, but teaching for so long, I mean, you don't script out your lessons as a teacher. You know what your questions are going to be, and you know what your first line is going to be, how it's going to move within the phase. But you have to learn to let go of perfection when you're delivering a lesson to students in person. And so I try to adopt that same mentality of there's for sure stuff I want in there, and I'm going to make sure my slides do that visually, but I'm also going to be okay if it's not as polished sounding as it might be had I rehearsed it a bajillion times or scripted it.
I want to talk about recording in regards to audience and tone. All right, so you're sitting alone in your house in 2020. You either stand up or you're sitting there. You press record. Because this is something that's going to be pre-recorded. You're going to have educators in Alaska, in Detroit, New York City, rural Florida, all sorts of folks watching it. Are you trying, like, who are you picturing that you're talking to? Are you picturing, are you trying to intentionally think of like 4 quadrants of educator, like rural and new, rural and experienced, urban and experienced? Are you thinking quadrants? Or are you picturing like an educator that's a buddy that you have great conversation with, you go deep, but you also keep it light? Who are you picturing when you're staring at this, blinking green light while you're recording?
Yeah, I'm very much thinking of specific colleagues that represent some of those archetypes. I don't worry too much about regionally because, I think more in education, you get these archetypes of types of teachers than necessarily that's influenced by the region. And so I have my department head in mind, who is the most intelligent and cynical and well-informed human being I've ever met in my life. And so I'm picturing like, how would I need to frame this so that, he doesn't tear me a new one and pick me apart. I've got a colleague who's also very experienced as a veteran, but is also, he will only put something into play if it's really practical. And so like, how am I selling the practical element of this? I have the colleague in my mind who loves ideas. Like they get really geeked about ideas, but they go over the top. And so how am I going to make this a little bit more bite-sized so that they don't get too excited and over the top with it? So it's kind of more of like, these are the people I've worked with, and I have heard how they respond to professional development after the professional developer leaves. And so, and one part, like content-wise development and the tone I'm using, I'm keeping them in mind. But I'm also coming from the standpoint that seeing something on video and hearing a person on video is very different than in person. And you have to kick the gauge up when you're performing in an empty room in front of a camera a little bit differently than you do if you're just in person. And so I'm taking those elements of where they're at, but I'm also like, I need to bring up my energy. Like I really, even though I'm not going to be on video all the time, I'm using my hands to demonstrate what I'm saying. And I'm trying to put a smile on my face when I'm going to deliver something that's a little bit more jovial or funny. And so I think that's kind of almost that performer piece coming into play of like, I need to up the gradient or up my game a little bit so that they can feel my energy through the screen.
That's interesting. I tend to tell folks to tone down their energy when they're speakers who go to record something, because as a speaker, it's like someone sitting in row 30. They are 212 feet away from you.
Yeah.
Watching you. So things need to be a little bigger. Whereas when you're recording something, everyone is, 3 feet from you.
Yeah.
The camera's here. It is. If you brought like keynote energy to a one-on-one conversation in Starbucks, you'd be like, what kind of drugs are you on and where can I get them? And are you distributing them at the back of the table? So how do you think about your kind of delivery style, when the audience is right up in your face versus what you have a ton of reps in, which is the keynote?
Yeah. I think when considering energy, you're really trying to parcel out what are the different elements that we would pull together to say about someone's energy. So like volume is a piece of that energy. I'm not going to talk at the same volume that I do when I'm recording a video as I would when I'm presenting a keynote. But my tone of voice, like that's going to come across. And so the same tone I use and the inflections I use and the pauses that I put into play, I want to try to keep those at a pretty high level and pretty consistent, because I think that carries over into film or video a little bit more. Facial expressions, I think still like we're going to have some pretty strong facial expressions. I'm not going to go over the top, but if I am talking about a joke and they can't really see it on my face in video, then it's for sure not coming across, and it's going to be a little bit more flat. I also think there's probably a difference between if they can visually see me versus it's just slides and my audio is coming into play. I don't often feel like I have to up my elements of energy as much if they can see my face. But if it is just my voice, I try to work a lot harder on really making sure I am giving that full inflection and that tone and those pauses and using my facial expressions to try to pour out those emotions as well. It's just kind of how I framed it, to more or less not let myself go the other direction of just being like, I'm in front of an empty room.
Yeah, sure.
Because that I get more pulled into that category, I think, than going too big or too strong.
Let's talk about the business side of this. You're selling this course on Teachable. It's priced at essentially $100 for one license, $445 for 5, which kind of trickles down like $89 per license.
Yeah.
What did you think your business strategy was going to be to sell this course, and what has it actually ended up becoming?
So I mean, I will admit, and this is about me when we first started talking, like the business mindset and the business acumen is not my strength right now. Like I have to work extra hard to try to understand how to even approach and go about these things. And so, initially I was looking around of like, okay, who are some of the most successful educators or content developers in the educational space that are selling their own courses? And so I was finding these individuals. I was looking at what their pricing point was. I was actually like buying some of their courses and doing some research around like, what are people actually getting with this course? And so I kind of went into that mindset of like, I want to try to mirror as much as I can what they are doing with the type of content and how much content and the pricing point. But I would say I've kind of learned through the process is I wasn't and still haven't gotten as many like individual sales of someone picking up this course and being like, hey, I want this personally for me. I'm getting way more of this being kind of a leverage opportunity with districts or ISDs or organizations who are like, hey, we're actually going to pay for like a big chunk of the licenses because we want our staff to be exposed from it or to it. And so that has kind of shifted how I approach it, of not so much worrying or putting my energy into like the individual sale points, but if I am going to be providing this for a group of people, then how is my content going to have to look a little different? How is the initial launch need to look different? How is the follow-up potentially going to be built in to help out that?
Are most of these bulk licenses folks that have hosted you for a keynote or training, or folks that attended a keynote or training versus how many they've never seen you speak at all?
I think if I look back, probably about 70% is they have seen me or they're going to see me. So they've already, kind of bought into my content that I do. And probably about 30 to 40% is more like that. That's their access point where they haven't had me speak. I haven't been in there, but either they like the content or they like the topic around it, or they've at least heard of me in some other space or capacity. So sometimes that's kind of interesting, is like someone will pick up the license and then it becomes this point of like, ooh, should I like contact them of like, hey, I'm speaking, I would love to help launch this and use that, versus I'm speaking with a client and let them know, hey, I also have this follow-up resource. So after I'm done speaking, like this is available to you. That's
exactly the thing to figure out, and the tricky thing to figure out. Are you putting breadcrumbs in your speech anywhere where you sort of gently, not a hard sell, mention the course or these bulk licenses that have been purchased? Folks are kind of seeing you and just going, I wonder what else he has. He shared his website. I'm going to get on there. I'm going to dig into it. Which of those kind of approaches seems to be happening?
It tends to be much more the client wants more after I've spoken. And so I'm talking with them about it more than pitching it whole group, which isn't to say that I shouldn't do that. Like I absolutely should. It's just that's one of the pieces that I forget to do sometimes, is to like share with people like, here are other ways to access these ideas, and here's some ways to stay in connection. So much more, and this is part of what I do a lot within my approach to speaking, is really do a lot of connection before and after the event with the client of like, hey, here's what I want to know about your audience. Here's what you need to know about me. And then following up a lot of like, hey, I don't believe in like one-stop shop professional development. Like I care deeply about trying to help your staff, not in just short term, but the long term. What could it look like to partner moving forward? And so that's more often than not where those large licenses and connections start to come from.
Yeah. And and that's why having a quality keynote or a quality PD matters so much. Is not only does it sort of increase your spin-off rate. If you're keynoting at an event and there are 20 schools represented and you don't get at least 4 or 5 inquiries from that event, to me, that is sort of a data point that something isn't as good as it could be within that keynote. And then similarly, if you crush the keynote, then the teachers are leaning in, the principal, the assistant principal, the superintendent sees that and goes, cool, maybe they would engage with, with his further content and ideas.
Yeah, for sure. I think it again comes down to like the quality of what you do. If your keynote's crap, then they're not going to want the course. If your course is crap, they're not going to want to bring you in as a keynote. So really just trying our best to like give the full amount of quality attention that we can. And I think that's tricky if you feel like you have 3-4 different things you have to try to get really good and strong at, you still have to prioritize, like, where should I start? Should I start with really just developing the keynote? Should I make sure the course is in play? But just really always working and tweaking and tinkering.
Yeah. For you, the sequence was trainings, then the book, then the keynote, then the course. Is that correct?
Yep. That was
Is that the sequence you would advise to someone starting out?
I'll say this, the keynote, getting that changed everything. That was like the missing element, that once I had that down, it created way more workshop opportunities and way more interest in my writing and way more opportunities to even provide this course. So I think that's the most important piece for really trying to resonate with speaking and grow. On the flip side, though, I don't know, at least with my audience of educators, if I would have been as effective with my keynote, course development, writing, had I not had a really strong background in leading professional development. So I think, depending on where a person's skill set is, that they want to try to use that and maximize that to the best of their ability before they start to move into some of these other phases. But at the end of the day, I think that the keynote is huge.
I love it. Well, Chase, thank you for your insights.
For sure.
You're a sharp guy. It's an honor to work with you, and thanks for sharing all of your insights today.
I'm geeked to be on here. I'll send you all my songs. I'm just going to barrage you with songs I make up. I'm going to make up songs about you, Josh, about the podcast, and I'm just going to send them your way.
However it has to start. I don't give a crepe.
No,
I wrote down 3 bread puns. We're gonna jam them in right here at the end.
He didn't listen to a single one of your answers, actually, because he was working so hard on those things.
Yeah,
I saw him sweating.
It's really Chat GPT, but my prompting is incredible.
It is incredible.
It's
all about
I don't give a crepe. Let's just get that one out there.
Okay, what else you got?
Last but not yeast. Come on. And
all I heard was yeast is all in the air around us. That's something new to me.
Yeah, that's very philosophical.
It's not funny. It's just scary.
No, it's true.
It's
true.
It's also super gross that when you need bread by hand.
Can you guys shut up so I can get my third pun in here? This is
I need to share this. When you need bread by hand,
let's just ignore
some
Josh
of your DNA is now mixed in with that bread. So
that's profound.
You are bringing in the yeast from the air, but you're also bringing in the natural bacteria and yeast from your hands.
So
it's
Dave's
gross,
killer
but
bread
it
is actually Dave's killer bread.
See, now we got to tag this episode as explicit. This is just ridiculous.
And so what is the third? Because it better be so
let's
good.
Let's get ready to crumble.
Oh, dude, that was good. That was good.
Come on.
I like that.
That'll preach.
All right. Cheers, y'all.
Thanks, Jace.